We Equal School allows children to encompass their entire education in a playful environment. Much of this is accomplished because We Equal is essentially a school that children build for themselves. They teach each other in their learning pods, create clubs and classes, and even small businesses to help themselves and others to learn. They are, in a sense, playing school on a large and effective scale. That as kids mature emotionally, it's not so much that they stop playing, but the ways they play change. And so they will still be learning better if they are perceiving that they are playing. Young children learn best by interacting with the world around them. Like, we all understand that if you have a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, it's very hard to get them to understand, like, say, the danger of something just by telling them that it is dangerous. And if they experience that, they will understand it better, as in touching something hot. So this is a quote from one of the articles. It says, "Play should not be seen as tangential to learning, experts say, but should be viewed instead as the natural way young children learn. The parts of the brain that are most developed in the early years are the ones that respond to active experiences. In contrast, the parts of the brain that allow children to learn by listening to a lecture or watching a video are developed later." So in other words, young kids are not able to learn just by like hearing information or seeing information. They really have to interact with the world to form a learning experience in their brain. She says, "Play is essential to education. Play is education for children." Even at older ages, direct instruction is still not as effective as play is for learning, or as we say here at We Equal, learning by doing is always more effective. First of all, it is important to have a good definition of play. For many years, adults have defined play, and not many researchers actually conducted appropriate surveys to get children's opinions on what they consider to be play. One survey that did actually ask the children found that activities deemed as play are therefore freely chosen, voluntary, controlled, and directed by the child, have little or no adult involvement, and do not take place at a table. Additionally, peers being present was sometimes, but not always, important to indicate that an activity was perceived as play. Well, a study that surveyed children ages 5 to 8 on the differences or correlations between learning and play found that younger children in that sample were less likely to believe that learning and play could happen at the same time. So, in other words, kids, 5, 6-ish years old, if you tell them that they're learning, they won't believe that they're also playing. A lot of them, they can't understand that those two things could be happening at the same time. Whereas the kids closer to 8 were able to understand that a learning experience could also be a play experience, which I think is pretty interesting and a good thing to keep in mind when you're approaching younger kids. It's important to adopt playfulness in a child's definition, because for a child to get the best learning experience from play, they must believe they are playing. We can all remember a time we've attempted to entice a child into a playful activity, but for whatever reason, the child did not experience that activity to be play, likely because that activity was not freely chosen and controlled and directed by the child. Thus, it can be difficult for adults to plan playful learning activities for children. One study was able to evaluate children's ability to complete the same activity, which was doing jigsaw puzzles, in both a formal and playful setting. So in other words, they did the same activity in a way that to them was a more controlled, formal learning experience versus a way that was just them playing. And they were able to compare outcomes on those two different settings. It said children in the playful condition were more focused, less talkative, and more purposeful, with increased correct problem solving than the children in the formal practice condition. It would appear that there are differences between the way in which children and adults view play, and there is considerable value in utilizing children's views of play. Children who have practiced tasks under playful rather than formal conditions have demonstrated significantly greater improvement in performance across a range of activities. Behavioral differences have also been exhibited by children in the different practice conditions, which indicate greater on-task behavior, deeper involvement in the activity, and therefore a greater learning experience. In addition, during playful practice, children try out a range of purposeful behaviors, where in more formal conditions, they use fewer purposeful strategies and repeat behaviors, even if they are unsuccessful. These findings have implications for play practice in educational settings. Using children's perception of play enables practitioners to create playful environments. It also enables practitioners to view activities differently, and that they need not necessarily be seen as play or not play, but rather adaptable to enable children to approach them playfully. It also has implications for the role of the adult in play and practitioners that could develop their own playfulness when working with children. So the idea is that play, it's not necessarily about the specific activity that the kid is doing, but how they're viewing it. And a lot of that has to do with their choice and their agency in it. I believe the idea of children learning through play is essential to our process at Weequal School. Weequal School allows children to encompass their entire education in a playful environment. Much of this is accomplished because Weequal is essentially a school that children build for themselves. They teach each other in their learning pods, create clubs and classes, and even small businesses to help themselves and others to learn. They are, in a sense, playing school on a large and effective scale. The adults are here not in a teaching or limiting capacity, but only to facilitate what the children are doing and help when they need it. The staff at Weequal School is committed to interacting with children in a playful capacity and to help them achieve whatever they can imagine. So just as I thought about this, and I thought about Sume and Isla during the pandemic and, the great success of what you were doing. And I could see how for a lot of kids, they're like, we're just doing this with kids, we're just playing school, but in a very effective way, and the fact that it was with children and not with adults, I think made a big difference. And I think we need to keep a lot of this in mind as we go forward with Weequal. Just some of these principles I think will be very interesting. I have some resources and references at the bottom. Like I said, what I said there was just very brief compared to all the things that are out there to read. This pedagogy of play is very, very interesting. So there's a program that Harvard had called Project Zero, which is like a research program that they have had looking into education for many years. And they did this pedagogy of play is a whole program that they did with Lego, looking into play and education. And they ended up writing a book that there is actually an audio book, and the book itself is translated into Chinese as well. So you can get that online as a PDF, but that is really interesting. And I'm going to be listening to that. But something interesting is a lot of what they're looking at is still, how do adults choose a playful activity for children? And so here at Weequal, we're still doing something different, and that we're not trying to do that, right? We're trying to let the children choose the activities that work for them. Oh. Anyhow, so that's all I've got.
The perceptions that people have around these words and around these concepts in different environments, which I also saw in your project when it came to how kids would, act differently if they thought it was not a play setting, more of a formal setting. But I think that that's also just some of these, kind of artificial constructs of perception that we have that are kind of built up through our experiences and isn't necessarily an accurate representation of what's going on, because whether or not you classify something as like, a professional setting or a playful setting can sometimes cause conflicts, just like if you have, formal work relationships versus, personal relationships, and then there can be complications and overlaps with that. And part of that, I think, is also how you communicate to kids about these different sorts of environments, and how, even in a formal setting, that doesn't mean you just have to follow directions. You can still, assert your own agency with your own ideas. And maybe that's not something that's perceived as super fun or enjoyable, but that even that is kind of a preconception that can be built that isn't necessarily accurate. So I do think that you brought up a lot of really interesting concepts in your project, and there's a lot to think about.
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, like they said, this is all, how children perceive this stuff. So like the way they actually came up with like how do they perceive if it's play or not was they like showed it, they did it through pictures, so it was easier for kids to um kind of indicate that versus using abstract concepts. Um, but I think so much like most of what I saw is saying that so much of what indicates to a child whether it's play or not has to do with their agency in the situation, which I think is really important. And we take that into account. And, just kind of like they said, it wasn't really about the thing that they were doing, because they were able to take that same thing and get two different outcomes. It was more the adult's attitude and how the adult approached the situation. Um,
We
so
something interesting with kids where they would have like an idea that had the potential of being a profitable company, like a really cool business idea. But as soon as we started saying things like you're an entrepreneur and this is a business, then all of a sudden they would be like, never mind, and they're, like they didn't want that because there's like this pressure, and it's just changing the terminology.
Well, also defining terminology, because when you were talking about like what kids consider to be play, it was kind of like the characteristics, and how like certain differences in the environment, and how much freedom they had, whether it was out at table, all those things would influence whether or not they thought it was play. But I'm curious to know like what people would think is kind of a definition of play that is more like all encompassing from like the principles of what that situation would be like. Because I think for a lot of people, they might also consider play as almost like a simulated environment. Like I'm playing house, where I'm, pretending that I have a
Right?
house.
There's a fictional.
And then, so that's something that I kind of confused me, because when I heard playing school, at Weekly School, it's like I'm pretending to be at school, pretending to learn, but I'm not actually. But so I think that there can be some, interesting conversations around what it even is the definition of play, and how that can be considered. But
What is
right. Well, like I said, I think a lot of that is in part of which I edited this project a little bit just a bit ago, and the edits weren't in what I just showed you. But some of what I was saying about the way that children play changes as they grow older. So like Dan, I think, had introduced a concept before of hard play. So the idea that I think that's where like in our minds play is still something maybe that's not like, if you think of play, like you said, you think of something simulated or something not real or something not effective. And we need to kind of start to like divorce that in our minds, or bring it together. Like children's play is learning. Like it's not separated, right? So if they're playing something, like say they're viewing that they're playing school, doesn't mean they're not being educated. It doesn't mean they're not learning. It's just their perception of the situation because of the agency they have versus being in a situation where they're being educated and being told what they have to do. So that's where there's, you know, a lot of study into learning as play, and especially when we see kind of more simple cultures, like there's been so much study into hunter-gatherer children and play and how they essentially learn everything that they need to learn to be an adult through play. And so the idea of looking at something and being like, oh, I'm playing, does not at all need to mean that a kid isn't doing serious work and serious education.
Okay. Well, this is a longer discussion. There's also another word that we need to define, which is learning. I mean, just so technically learning is just you can't help but learn from a technical standpoint. If you're taking in sensory and you're experiencing emotions, then the synapses and the neurons and the connections in your brain, that is the constant forecasting, you know, that's what brains do, is they're constantly forecasting, trying to predict what's going to happen. You have certain objectives and you're trying to make these predictions, and then the learning happens emotionally. If you haven't learned how to actually think for yourself, you're just conditioned, just like an animal. And so, you know, kids are going to learn no matter what. Unfortunately, like some kinds of learning are just not very effective, or they can be very coercive, or what have you.
Or it can be learning and you're learning things that are untrue, or not actually making your forecasting model less accurate.
Oh yeah.
So
Like somebody
plenty of
who's
that.
struck by lightning, they learn, oh my God, if there's clouds outside, I should never go outside. Right? Like you can learn some really messed up things, but play is an interesting one that we haven't talked about trying to define.
Mhm.
So next time we should definitely try to
Some
define
project
play.
Yeah.
Play.
Well, and I think that this very much fits in with the idea of deschooling, because if you're only asking kids what play is who have experienced the traditional school system, that's going to be very, very different than if you say take kids who have only ever experienced learning by play and not experienced somebody coming in and being like, okay, now you're going to learn, right? I think that would be a very interesting thing. Don't know if anybody's ever done that.